it's Vanessa the Crafty Gemini, and in this video I want to chat about stitch length, when to lengthen or shorten it, and why it's important when you're sewing. Alright, so before we start stitching out some samples, I want to show you on this specific machine because I think the visual here is going to really help get this point across. We're talking about straight stitches, nothing else, not zigzag or decorative stitches at this point. So the default setting on this machine is stitch number 1, that's a straight stitch. If you look here to the left, you see the same little dashed line that we see here representing the stitch length. And its default setting is to 2 millimeters in length. That tells me that every time the needle goes into the fabric, back up, and back into the fabric, the feed dogs have pulled that fabric through so that the stitch itself measures 2 millimeters long. Okay, that's what that means here. And you can adjust this. You can make it longer or you can make it shorter. And so as I change this setting, I want you to have a look here at what happens to the stitches so you can understand how stitch length works. Now, I know this is a computerized machine. This is my new Juki NX7 that I've upgraded to recently, but the same settings will be even on a mechanical machine. You just might have knobs that you would turn like 1, 2, 3 millimeters. You can always put them in the middle, like 2.5, right? So you can adjust that also. You would just look for an icon that has the dashed line, and that will be where you adjust your stitch length settings. So this little dash line here tells me that I'm going to turn this knob to change the stitch length. So I'm going to go up first. And if I increase it, you can see how the number's climbing, 3, 3.4, 3.8. Notice what's happening to these stitches. They're getting longer and longer, okay? And the machine beeping tells me I can't go any further. So the stitch length here on this machine goes up to 5 millimeters in length, and you can see how long and spaced out those are. Now let's go in the opposite direction so you can see how the stitches are going to get smaller. So if I decrease stitch length all the way down, you can go to 0.0. You see at 0, it's not really going to stitch because that means that the fabric is not even getting pulled through. It's simply going to be doing stitches in place. There is no length to it, right? So if I go to 0.2, you can probably barely see they're tiny dots. They're not even dashes anymore because that stitch length is so small. And then you can see at 1.8, they get a little bit bigger, 2.0. So the default settings are usually going to be, you know, somewhere here. You see how this is blue? This is the typical. And oftentimes you'll find it be around this 2.5 millimeter setting. And that's where I would probably recommend that you sew most all your projects, maybe 85% of the time. This is a good length, okay? Both for construction seams and even for some basic top stitching. Now I'll show you some instances and some examples in some of the projects that I've completed on where I would use a really small stitch length, like 2 millimeters or even smaller, 1.8. And then where I would use something higher, like 3.5 or 3.0, okay? So here's one of my essential wallets, and you can see in the back here, so on this project here, you can probably see that these stitches are quite small right here. This is probably 2.0, maybe 1.8 millimeters in length. And one reason that I would have used that here, even though it is top stitching. Now, top stitching means any stitches that you see on the exterior, right? They can either be quilting stitches like this. This is often called top stitching. This row of stitching here around this rounded portion is also called top stitching. But here in this case, I kept them smaller because this is a pocket. And for a pocket on the back of a wallet here, it's gonna get a lot of wear and tear, slipping stuff in here, pulling stuff out, straining it if I pack it too tightly. And so I don't want these stitches coming apart easily. So I did shorter stitches and 2 rows of stitches. So that's kind of how you want to start thinking about what stitch length you're going to be using, and what you're using it for is going to determine how short or how long you want that stitch length to be. So everything relates, okay? Now let's talk a little about top stitching. So in a project like this, where the top stitching is not really there to hold anything in place for wear and tear purposes, you can see that I used a lot longer stitch length. Here I went about 3.5 millimeters. And the reason for that is that in this case, it's more just of a decorative finish. It's to help hold the lining down and into the project so it doesn't bubble up and get in my way when I'm trying to use the zipper. And there's really no need for that to be super, super tiny, right? Because at that point, then you're going through more layers of bulk. And if you try to stitch really tiny stitches through more or multiple layers of fabric, you will often find that maybe your machine just gets hung up and is not able to feed all those layers of fabric through easily. So that's another tip. If you are sewing with a really short stitch length through multiple layers and the machine is like getting hung up and it's just stitching in the same place and it doesn't want to like pull through, a quick tip to fix that is to lengthen your stitch length so that the machine is now pulling more fabric through before it completes a stitch. Here's another example of top stitching. Now this is already a thicker thread. Okay, I didn't use a twin needle on here. This is a pair of jeans that I'm making myself, but the stitch length here is about a 3.5 also. And what I find is in instances of top stitching, okay, where it's going to be a decorative finish, notice I'm using a contrasting thread to the denim, so it's going to pop. All right, and this works a lot for top stitching with fun pops of colored threads, variegated threads. I find that when I lengthen the stitch length a little bit, the stitches are a little more defined, I can see them better, and it allows the stitches to pop even more, okay? Because if they were tiny and a lot tighter, it wouldn't look as cute, like you wouldn't really tell that they're individual stitches like this. Plus, because this is a pair of jeans, I'm stitching through thick denim, okay? And I'm stitching through a seam allowance that's in there plus the lining fabric for the pocket, okay? So again, we've added more layers of bulk. I don't want to have those stitches be super short. I want to lengthen them then to get some nice top stitching. All right, so here's another project. This is my 2-hour tote bag, and I'll include links to some of these projects in the description box below in case you want to sign up for the courses. But here's another one. On a tote bag, these webbing straps are going to be holding all of the weight of whatever I put inside this bag. So when I top stitch here, although it is top stitch and it's going to show on the outside, notice what I did. I used a gray thread so it's not visible, but I kept the stitch length super short because I want the layers to hold together even more. Because this is going to be holding all the weight of the fabric, a lot of wear and tear here, I don't want to have a long stitch length because anytime you tug on this, those stitches will just start to pop out over time. Okay, so you got to think about what type of wear and tear is going to be going on where those stitches will be, and that will also help you determine how short or how long to set that stitch length for whatever you're sewing. So on the inside here, I can show you because you can't see it here. I used gray thread, okay? But if I flip it to the inside, I think you can see it even just a little bit. Let me get a close-up. And I used about a 2mm length here. I couldn't go smaller than that because, again, I'm going through webbing, a layer of fabric, a layer of batting, and another layer of fabric. So again, even with a walking foot, some machines will have a lot of trouble trying to get through all those layers with a really short or tight stitch length. So 2mm on mine with a walking foot, I was easily able to stitch that down, and I know that that's going to be held in place for a long time to come. All right, so now let's stitch out some stitches. I have a contrasting thread in here. I believe I have gray thread on top and a white bobbin. So either side I should be able to show you pretty well. I'm going to start off with like a 0.4mm length. So let's drop this down to 0.4 so you can see how tight that's going to be. You can see the fabric is barely moving through. I mean, like, even if you feed it, the feed dogs are only pulling barely any fabric because we've set the stitch length so short. I'm going to stop right there because that's taking forever, so that's something else to note. The shorter the stitch, the longer it's going to take you to stitch those seams. So let's cut right there just so we can show you what it looks like. So that's with the stitch length set to 0.4mm. You can see that it doesn't even really look like anything. You don't have good stitch definition. It's not really something that you want to see, right, in your project. You would definitely not use that for any top stitching, but you can see when I open it and tug on it, no matter how hard I want to tug, that seam isn't going anywhere. So the shorter the stitch length, the tighter it's going to hold that seam together. But you also have to think about that because the same way it's going to be there super tightly holding these two pieces of fabric together, it's going to be virtually impossible for you to get a seam ripper through any of these stitches if you have to take this seam out. You would probably just have to start all over. So think about that as well. All right, so for the next sample, let's go ahead and stitch at 3mm in length. So let's go up to 3. And you'll see how this stitch is a lot faster than the one we just did. All right, so at 3mm in length, you see that now you can actually see the individual stitches. It looks a lot better. And this is often a stitch length I like to use, as I've already showed you, for top stitching. All right, so now let's set it to the highest length that this machine allows, and we'll test that. All right, so we're gonna set this to, I believe it was, all right, so we're gonna set this one to, I believe it was 5mm. Yep, that's the highest, so this is what we would call a basting stitch. So here you can see 5mm in length, and the idea is that used as a basting stitch, because the stitches are so long, it's a lot easier for you to put in a seam ripper and pop this seam out really quickly. So typically it's used, something like this, for a temporary hold, for you to check the fit on a garment, or just to check if things match up before you go in with the permanent line of stitching, and I'll show you why. Notice that when I stitched out this sample, I did not backstitch at the beginning and at the ends. If you had a seam like this in a garment that would get a lot of wear and tear, you can see what's going to happen. I don't have to work really hard to just separate the two pieces. So imagine this is something that's getting a lot of wear and tear. You can see that that seam is just going to fall apart. So again, when you're thinking and trying to figure out what stitch length to use on a project, if the pattern or tutorial that you're following doesn't give you any guidance in that direction, think about what kind of seam you're stitching together. All right, so there you have it, some tips and things to consider next time you sit down at the sewing machine. Remember, you can always use a shorter stitch length for things that you want to hold together really securely, but if you're sewing through multiple layers, you'll want to lengthen that stitch. If it's some top stitching, I like to stay around 3 to 4mm in length to get really good stitch definition and allow whatever the thread color is to pop, especially if you're sewing through multiple layers. And then if you're auditioning something, the fit on a garment, or maybe you're working on a brand new handbag project and you still can't really wrap your head around how the pieces are gonna come together, a basting stitch is a great way to audition something before you go in to secure it with the final stitch length, okay? So think about all those things the next time you're either designing your own project or tackling a brand new pattern. Now, if you enjoyed this video or maybe you learned something new, make sure to give it a thumbs up below. And if you have a tip to share with us about what you like to do when it comes to adjusting your stitch lengths, leave me a comment below and let us know. I always read your comments, and I'm sure so many more of us sewists can learn from your tips. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my future videos, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Or you learned something new, make sure to leave me a comment. If you enjoyed this video or you shared, just leave it in the comment section below because I always read your comments. It's too much. All right, so 3mm. You can see that we have a little bit better stitch definition, not a little bit better, a lot of bit better.